So I think to understand why we have this shift and why we've prepared this paper, it's worth going back 40 years, back to 1985 in the UN Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims. So that paper really is the origins of the international agreements on what we need to do for victims of crime. And it specifically includes commitments around information rights. Over the course of those 40 years, we've had Council of Europe recommendations, we've had an EU victims framework decision from 2001, we've got a 2012 Victims' Rights Directive, all setting out different obligations around information. So we've known about this for 40 years, and yet still today we know that victims don't receive the information that they need, that when they do receive that information, it's either of a poor quality or it's not usable or actionable. So after 40 years, there's still wide-ranging problems when it comes to victims getting information on their rights and services, information about the criminal proceedings about their case. That's the origins of why we saw we needed a shift and why we needed to actually address the problems and barriers of victims receiving information. But we also have this shift from the notion of information rights, which is really focused on receipt of information, to a focus on communication, which means that victims should receive the information, that they should be able to understand it, and they should be able to act on it. So it's useless having information if you don't understand it. And we have hundreds and hundreds of examples of victims who for example, have been told that they have the right to be a joint prosecutor and they're given a letter to sign, but it's not really explained to them, well, what does that mean in terms of being a joint prosecutor? What are the responsibilities? What do they lose out on if they're not a joint prosecutor? Or they receive a letter telling them that they need to sign some information. Again, they don't really understand what's the information that has been provided to them. So it's no point in providing information if it's not usable. On top of that, we look at what are the barriers to organizations and to states in providing that information. So we know that victims don't get it. We know that they don't understand it or can't action it. Now we're trying to understand why is that happening. And there's multiple complexities within the victim's environment. We're talking about many different kinds of victims, whether it's because of the type of crime, the personal characteristics of the victim, their personal situation. And you have to take all of that into account when you're trying to provide information to victims in a usable way. It needs to be targeted, selected, individualized in some way. So we have to understand that we're operating in a complex environment, and you have multiple different actors, not just the prosecutor, not just the judge or the police service, but you've got victim support services, you've got the health sector, the education sector, social services. All of these different organizations have a role and a responsibility in informing victims and also listening to victims. And they're all, if they're not operating in a coherent and coordinated manner, then either you end up with information being duplicated, or maybe you'll have gaps in the information that are provided to victims, or you'll have contradictions or differences in what different organizations provide to victims. So that indicates to us, and this is why we produced the paper, that you need a coherent framework around which information is provided and turned into a communication process. And not only do we create a system where information is provided and usable, but we also create a system where victims themselves can effectively communicate with those organizations as well. And this notion of communication fits in with our broader objectives around a national victim support framework, but also around a safe justice system, which includes the enhancing the ability of victims to be heard and to give evidence.